You're listening to Factory Reset, a podcast brought to you by the New Political Economy Initiative at IIT Bombay. From India's industrial shifts to lessons from the world over, our host for the season, Srinivasan Iyer, is unpacking the historical blueprints, the breakthroughs, and the contemporary bold lessons that reset our thinking on the economy.
We have with us Professor Jayan Jose Thomas, who teaches at the IIT Delhi. Welcome, Jayan, and thanks for this.
Thank you, Srini, and thank you, Chinju, for giving me this opportunity. I'll be very happy to share my insights on.
Can you please begin with defining how you would be interpreting the term industrial policy for the rest of this discussion?
Thank you. I think I would like to deal with this question. I'm looking at the development trajectories, not just of India, but of other countries which had industrialized in the past. And we know one of the theories that is well known is the theory of comparative advantage. We must understand when David Ricardo developed this theory in the 19th century, 18th century, or when Paul Samuelson popularized this theory, the HOS theorem, in the 1950s. Both were speaking from the vantage point of the economically dominant economy. Like Ricardo was speaking about from the vantage point of Britain, Samuelson was speaking about the US. Both were the dominant economies at that point in time. And what does comparative advantage theory tells us that a country has to specialize in industries in which it has a advantage, a resource advantage, a comparative advantage. And the comparative advantage essentially comes from, if you're a labor surplus country like India, your comparative advantage is in labor intensive industries. Whereas if you're if you're a country with, what does that leave, where does that leave developing countries like India? Or, so I think that is the question that we have to understand. So when a country like India and China, began industrialization in the 1950s, we see that they were dominated by colonial powers, directly in the case of India for 2 centuries and indirectly in the case of China. They were highly underdeveloped economies. They had a very, the relation with their colonial powers was certainly the industrial structures were in an underdeveloped state. And planning, which we began at that time, was clearly a way to break out of this underdevelopment. And how did we go about this? In fact, by going against the theory of comparative advantage, which the economic mainstream argues. A country like India, we were labor surplus in the 1950s, we were a poor country in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, both India and China were labor surplus economies. So if we had followed the mainstream comparative advantage theory, we would only have been going for labor-intensive industries, maybe just textiles or garments. But we actually went against that. If you look at the planning of the 1950s, we actually went against the mainstream economic theory, mainstream comparative advantage theory. In the 1950s itself, India started investments in space research, atomic energy. We established the IITs, one of which is where we sit now. And we entered capital intensive and technology intensive industries despite the fact that we were a very poor country at that time. And whatever said and done, we look back from 2022, if we look back, what did that planning do for us? It clearly has, paid dividends. If many Indians are today at high positions in technology companies, the worldwide, many of them have come through the institutions that India built in the early decades. If India is getting so much attention internationally, it is also because of the technological prowess that this country has. And a lot of it has to do with, making this big break from trying to build a modern economy from a very underdeveloped economy in the 1950s. And that is clearly the path followed in the East Asian case also, because the East Asians were a more successful case of industrialization, where they combined markets and state intervention much more effectively. And I think the best text in this comes from Alice Armstrong, who wrote about South Korea's industrialization experience. And she writes that the East Asian countries, especially South Korea, was successful not because they followed the comparative advantage theory, but actually going against, getting relative prices wrong. The mainstream idea is getting relative prices right. If you're a labor surplus country, your wages should remain low, your capital costs should remain high, given the scarcity of capital in that country. But South Korea actually went against that by getting capital cheap, that is, by providing subsidy to industries or specific industrial firms. So, in fact, by getting relative prices wrong. So I think industrial policy has had a long, long history. At least starting from the 1950s, when many of the developing countries started industrialization. You had India and China, you had the East Asian countries, and you had many other developing countries in Latin America or African countries trying to industrialize. And each of them needed policies that were different from the policies that had been followed in the economically dominant countries. The policies that were followed in Britain in the 18th century, because Britain had not just economic superiority, but also military strength. Or for that matter, when the US industrialized in the 19th century and the 20th century, it was a superpower. Whereas for a developing country, you need different set of policies. And I think the word industrial policy today captures all that.
There is a distinction doing the rounds between industrial policy and light industrial policy. So is that a meaningful distinction?
My understanding is light industrial policy means, industrial policy without much pain, without much investment by the government, getting things relatively easy. Perhaps, I don't know if it can also mean, the government role is only to, ease of doing business. Is that the right? I think, this is a distinction that has to be very clearly understood, especially in the Indian context, or perhaps in the context of other developing countries that are going to industrialize. I think light industrial policy will not help us, achieve success in industrialization. If you look at the Indian situation, for instance, I think what is important is investment is the key. Investment is the key both for creating and for a developing country. Starting from the 1950s, much of the development literature talks about the specific problems of developing countries. The specific problems include, you have a supply constraint. You don't have the machines, you don't have the technology, you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the roads, the ports. We also have a demand constraint, because you're a country with low incomes, and a country with low incomes means the demand is also low, consumption expenditure is low. Now the need for planning at that time, and if you call industrial policy today, is to intervene both the supply, or to transform both the supply and the demand fronts. And unfortunately, it is very unlikely to happen from the private sector. If you expect the private sector to come invest in a poor country, it is very unlikely to happen. So I guess that is where public investment comes in. That was the reason for public investment in India in the 1950s. That is the reason for public investment in India even today, because in India, or large parts of India even today, or for that matter, large parts of Africa or large parts of South Asian countries, they are, whether we like it or not, unfortunately, they still face both the supply and the demand constraints. And because we need much bigger intervention. And perhaps one more point I want to make here is about the point about technology. And very interesting quote here is coming from John Robinson, a very eminent economist. she actually said that technology is not like a manna from heaven. You don't really expect. In fact, I think this is another myth that the mainstream economists try to, say that, look, technological diffusion happens automatically, or foreign companies invest in new technologies in a developing country. No, that is not going to happen. Because typically, technological advances happen with investments. I mean, even in developed countries, technological investments have happened, technological advances have happened with public investment. Mariano Mazzucato's famous work, The Entrepreneurial State, recently shows how even in the US, it was largely the public sector, the government investment, which led to the technological advances in whether it is the internet, whether it is the biotechnology. And for a developing country, the need is much more. Yeah, I think I can talk about the other factors later, but yes, I guess these are to the two. One is the investment, the other is the technology side of the
You have worked and written that India is a large federal country, which with substantive differences across states at least. And you also worked very closely with the state government. So, would you think it's important to reflect upon industrial policy both at the level of the center as well as disaggregated at the level of states or regions?
Thank you. I think that's in fact a point which I wanted to mention in your previous question itself. Why we need very specific targeted industrial policies and investments. Look again in India, because I work with Kerala, and Kerala is a state which is somewhat advanced in terms of its social sector development. And it's also a state which is slowly aging. When the rest of India has a young, relatively young population, states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and perhaps to some extent a few other states like Uttaranchal or perhaps Punjab, they all have an aging population, which also means that the possibilities for future industrial growth are quite different in Kerala compared to, say, Uttar Pradesh, which has a very young population. In Uttar Pradesh, you can have both labor intensive as well as technology intensive industries. Whereas in Kerala or Tamil Nadu, increasingly you will have to move into more technologically advanced industries. Unfortunately, in India, what we do is states actually compete with each other for largely private and foreign investments, mainly by giving tax concessions or other kind of concessions when it comes to labor or environment. That is certainly not going to help because each state has a very different need. Yeah. So the ease of doing business. In fact, you have these rankings inspired by the World Bank methodology. Ease of doing business rankings of states also do not really mean much because the states are very different in terms of their current economic structures and future economic potential. So each state actually requires a different industrial policy. Yeah, some of the states really need investments. If you think to build biotechnology, I mean, many of these industries are in a very nascent stage in India. So many of these, we need investments from the.
Can you please list out some important policy instruments that are currently deployed in India, either at the center or the state, which collectively would constitute industrial policy? It will just familiarize the listener to what you're speaking about.
I do not want to make a list of the policies that are currently going on, but I can speak about the current state of manufacturing in India, perhaps, and that might give us an idea about what are the kind of policies that are needed. But perhaps I can, even before that, I must mention that one of the most important challenges that India faces today is with respect to employment creation. And that is also because of our demographic structure. You have a young population, as all of us know, is both a great opportunity, the so-called demographic dividend, but also a big challenge because you have to create employment for the people who are entering the labor market. Now, I have done studies using the employment surveys, the national employment surveys, the national sample surveys and the periodic labor force surveys. And one thing is very clear, very marked, is that we are not creating enough employment opportunities. And to give a measure to that statement, our labor supply or the potential labor supply in non-agricultural sectors, that is industry, construction, services. So the addition to that potential labor supply comes from, you have a natural growth of the working age population, but you also have, or you expect, a shift of the working age, shift of the population or the shift of the workforce from agriculture. Your previous generation, you had been engaged in agriculture, but your sons or daughters might actually want to move out of agriculture, come out of the rural areas. And also, enrollment has been increasing in India. Enrollment in educational institutions, which means that the young people are looking for better, more quality jobs. So I've estimated that during the period between 2012 and 2018, the potential labor supply, those who could potentially be employed in industry, construction, and services, the non-agricultural sectors, that grew at the rate of 17.5 million a year. But the actual employment creation in India, in these sectors, in the non-agricultural sectors, that is industry, construction, and services, was only at the rate of 4.5 million a year. So you can see a big mismatch there. 17.5 million is the rate at which the potential workforce could have been growing, which could have been a huge economic, dividend for India. But unfortunately, our economy is generating only 4.5 million jobs. So the mismatch is resulting in unemployment among the young, but particularly among the young men. But in the case of women, we actually see a slightly different phenomenon where we see even young women reporting their status as activity status. When the investigators ask, what is your activity status? Many of them report their activity status as not in the labor force, that they are not even looking for a job. It could be possibly a discouragement effect. Now, manufacturing, the absence of manufacturing employment is a major factor. So our manufacturing, the share of manufacturing in total employment has been kind of steady at 12%. It hasn't really grown. And we must also see that when we look at manufacturing, let's say our manufacturing employment is something around 60 million. Of the 60 million, only around 15 million are in the factory sector. What are factories? Factories are enterprises which employ more than 10 workers with electricity or more than 20 workers without electricity. So the rest, almost 75% of our manufacturing employment is in very small industries, very small enterprises. So when we talk about industrial policy, we have to actually talk about both. We should be talking about how to revive the very small industries, how to strengthen them, and what are the important measures required to strengthen them. We need measures, starting with, I believe, something like credit. The credit received by micro and small industries in India. If you remember the post-nationalization of banks, there's been a large increase in credit extended to micro and small industries. So in 91, the credit received by micro and small industries as a proportion of total credit by scheduled commercial banks in India was 15%. It reduced to around 6% by the early 2000s. So there's a sharp decline there. And in fact, it's been continuously declining. So in 2018, it was, I think, less than 5%. So, so something like credit is just a starting point. You also need technological capabilities. You also need managerial capabilities, because many of these are enterprises started by workers themselves, worker turned entrepreneurs. If you go to Coimbatore, for instance, or if you go to Rajkot, or if you go to Faridabad in Delhi, you find such enterprises. But these are the enterprises which create employment. So we need to strengthen them. But at the other end, of course, we need enterprises, firms which are engaged in high technology industries. There's a clear government policies have in recent times been targeting the semiconductor industry, which is clearly a positive sign. Yeah, I think these are the multiple industries that we have to look at.
No. Thanks for actually skipping to a question that I had for you subsequently, which is, what could be the features of industrial policy to attain socially desirable goals? And employment will perhaps be on top of the list of what's desired as the outcome of industrial policy. But let's pull back to what there is. And current industrial policy, several of the instruments by the government's claim are aimed at, in a sense, making the Indian economy leapfrog to the technological frontier so that India starts specializing in capital intensive, technology intensive sectors such as the semiconductor industry or electronics manufacture, medical equipment, communications, and stuff like that. So, how would you assess is the potential for such policies to succeed in India, given contemporary global conditions and eventually sort of also domestic conditions? But first, let's start against contemporary global conditions. Do you think India's ambition to vault into the high-tech zone of the dominant player in these emerging, very crucial, strategically important sectors?
No, I think India always had very high potential, and India has always been a big player in high technology sectors. So, I mean, India, we are a leading player in the IT industry. So it's a natural progression that to think that from IT industry to electronic manufacturing, we should be, and therefore I don't think, I think it's clearly, I mean, it's clearly important for India to be at the top of the technological ladder, especially when it comes to electronic or telecommunication equipment. Because you're going to see, we already have a very large market for mobile phones. You're going to see a much larger expansion in those industries in the coming years. So, in fact, it is surprising why India is still not a major player in, for instance, the semiconductor industry. And I think that is perhaps where I actually want to spend some time. You know, so I'm not so sure whether, in fact, to gain entry into those technologically sophisticated industries such as the semiconductor industry, you need perhaps much greater intervention. And a large part of the intervention has to come from the government. Look at Taiwan, which is the leader in the semiconductor industry. I had an opportunity to visit the Hsinchu campus of ITRI, which is the Industrial Technology Research Institute, which has been the key institution in Taiwan, which led this, led its technological advances and industrial advances from the 1970s onwards, right from the 1970s. And one thing which struck me, and this ITRI is a semi-government institution. It's an institution which, and it's a very clear example of the industrial policy, how industrial policy is conducted in East Asia. You have the government, you have the private sector, they work very closely with each other. One thing which struck me when I visited the Hsinchu campus of ITRI was that they had 7,000 PhDs only working on industrial policy. 7,000 PhDs only working on industrial policy. So you can imagine the kind of effort, and a large part of this effort is driven by the government. It's driven by the government. Maybe not entirely government money which is going there, but it's driven by the government. But we don't have a similar institution in India. I worked in the planning board in Kerala, and I know when it comes to planning about new industries, we have very little capabilities, very little financial capabilities to think of. I don't think we have a similar institution even at the national level. Although we can, and at the same time, it's strange because India is a country with huge amount of talent, people who have the talent, who can actually contribute to it. I know the engineers in this institution, very talented engineers. So we have all the right resources to enter into technologically advanced industries, be it be it semiconductor manufacturing, be it electronics, be it biotechnology, but we don't really have that institutional framework, and we don't have that. I don't think industrial policy is clearly. In fact, one of the like I was trying to say at the beginning, India was one of the few countries which understood the importance of planning in the 1950s. In 1991, we left planning. Planning became a less fashionable word, but we actually forgot in the meantime that, even in countries like East Asia, there is, you may not call that planning, but you call that industrial policy. There is great amount of coordination from the government. There's great amount of intervention from the government. Government working with the strategic industries. Which are the strategic industries? Which are the big players? So we actually lost all that coordination. If you don't want to use the word planning, we lost all that. I think that is where we are really missing. So I guess your interest, this effort to revive industrial policy is clearly the most needed one for India at this moment. And yes, we can actually start with technologically sophisticated industries, but yes, I can also come back to the other set of industries if there is time.
You worked extensively with the Kerala state government and are also quite familiar with state level, not merely policy, but also government interventions to influence industry. And you have the neighbor Tamil Nadu, which has been quite successful in attracting industrial investments of various kinds. Now, would you like to describe some of the more successful efforts by these states, or where they fell short in attracting industrial investment, in shaping industrial activity, both ways, where you feel, there has been indeed subnational activity which was important, not merely in what you said earlier, which is defining the sectors where they could grow, but also to get industry to just grow.
I mean, if I speak about Kerala, Kerala is, as you all know, has been one place where state intervened from the very beginning, from the 1960s onwards, in social policies, in health, education, and so on. One can actually see a similar effort by the state in also setting up industries. Although those efforts were not greatly successful in the end, and therefore is less well known. So less known about those. I mean, for instance, Kerala started Keltron in 1973. So the entry into electronics, and I think Kerala was the very first state in India to start a state public sector electronic manufacturing as early as, as early as any other region in the world, any other developing region in the world. But it was not greatly successful. Kerala was also the first state in India to launch the IT park. The Thiruvananthapuram IT park was, I understand, is the very first IT sector. So there have been efforts, and the efforts have been mixed. The results have been mixed, and I guess one reason why they've not been very successful, and this is not just for Kerala, but this is a problem for all Indian states, is that states have very little financial independence in the in India, given the structure of our fiscal relations, center-state fiscal relations. Because most of the tax raising powers are with the central government. The states have very little powers. I mean, because I was helping the state government with industrial policy, our entire budget for industry in Kerala at that time, I mean, this was a few years, 2-3 years back, while I was with the planning board, was something like 1,000 crores, which is, as you can see, very little for the government to intervene. But as I already mentioned, for a state like Kerala, for a state like Tamil Nadu, because these are states which are losing their advantages in low-wage industries. So, textiles or garment industry. Garment is a major sector in Tamil Nadu. Used to be a major source of employment in Tamil Nadu. But increasingly, Tamil Nadu will be losing. In fact, it is already lost its advantages because I mean, you don't find workers. You have to be increasingly dependent on migrant workers. So whereas you have a large unemployment problem, skilled unemployment, people who are skilled, and so to create new industries that actually cater to, which can employ skilled workers, you need perhaps bigger investment from the government, which unfortunately many state governments are not able to make.
In this context of fiscally constrained state governments, do you see room for what we referred to earlier as light industrial policy? See a state government helping industrial units to acquire land, or to get an electricity connection, or some local roads, and those may not be so intensive in terms of investment, but may also iron out, in a sense, the difficulties that investors may face, and therefore may make it a more attractive industrial destination.
If I can speak about fiscal conservatism first, is that what you meant? Because I think that is one of the core questions in this, and I guess this is a problem. Fiscal conservatism is a problem affecting the entire country, and this is not just at the state level, because states do not have resources that they are not spending. The central government have probably have a greater freedom to spend, but they're also not spending because generally they don't want to overspend because the fear of exceeding the fiscal deficit targets. Now, how is it affecting industrial growth or overall economic growth? I can give you one example, because I was speaking about how to move into technologically more advanced economic structures. I just looked at this particular data. The NEET exam, the entrance exam for medical colleges, 2 million students write that exam, and only 2% of that get into medical colleges. 2%. So the success rate is 2%. Now imagine if you had more medical colleges, if you had more engineering colleges in this country, if you could offer much better technical education in this country, imagine the effect that it can have. The number of engineers it can create, the number of nurses, the number of doctors, the number of health professionals. And when you have highly qualified professionals, you can actually jump into any kind of industries. In fact, so that is what I would say. Investment, and I mentioned this again, emphasize this point about public investment. Public investment, be it in industry, be it in education, be it in health, they can revive both the supply and the demand simultaneously. So on the one hand, you're creating employment for teachers when you build new colleges, but on the other hand, you're creating a new workforce for technologically advanced industries. So I think that is a need, and it's a very important need for many states, like states which have already reached, the demographic potential is already there. I mean, they are already, they cannot gain any more by having a young workforce. They don't have a young workforce. They can only gain, you don't have the numbers now. You only have, you actually have to create more value out of the existing workforce. So that's a clear challenge for a state like Kerala, for a state like Tamil Nadu, for a state like Punjab. So, and if you don't act today, you can imagine the social tensions that it can create, the unemployment that it can create. You also see out migration from many of these regions in India, let's say from Punjab or from Kerala or Tamil Nadu. In fact, you're losing talent. And they will be working in technology industries, let's say in Singapore or in Canada so why should we do that? So yes, I guess, I think your point about fiscal conservatism is a very important one. I guess, we are at a stage in India now where, you have huge opportunities. You have a young workforce. You have I mean, you have a lot of unutilized potential. You have a lot of unutilized resources. And that is a classic case where, as Keynes argued, when you have unutilized potential, when your factories are operating at less than its capacity, then you have a demand problem, and that problem can also be resolved by investment. And that investment, if it's not coming from the private sector, which has been our experience from 2011, like I said, the investment has been on its decline. It has to come from the public sector.
Let me turn back to an issue that you had mentioned earlier, which is the potential of growth of the unorganized manufacturing sector, where in fact there's a maximum number of workers in the manufacturing sector. Uh, so that's an obvious socially desirable goal, because that's where the workers exist now. Do you see room for creative industrial policy action in that space, including, in fact, stretching the buzz about startups and early stage facilitation to that segment of the manufacturing as well?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a very important question. Now, on the one hand, we must understand the unorganized sector in India is certainly, operating much below its potential. Most of the enterprises are technologically quite backward. Many of the entrepreneurs are themselves may not be having the best of education, and so on and so forth. But if you also look at it from the other end, now half of India's workforce are self-employed. Self-employed is, in fact, they're all entrepreneurs. So you probably have 200 million entrepreneurs in this country. Yeah. So the question is how on the one hand you have millions of entrepreneurs, but they are operating with low amount of financial resources, with very little technological capabilities. So you have a real problem here, and you have a real opportunity here. And I guess this again requires interventions both at supply and demand. So I already mentioned the credit issue, but an equally important problem was the infrastructure issue, where of course India is making some progress in that. But overall, if you look at the infrastructure and also the demand problem, one statistic I want to highlight here, our investment as a share of GDP, because that's a clear indicator of how both the supply and the demand are growing. It has been growing during the 2000s, from the early 2000s. It increased to around 40% in 2007. And in fact, India was marginally above China when it comes to investment rates in 2007. But from 2007, following the financial crisis, India was quite, again, fiscal conservatism. India reduced both public investment, private investors also got cold feet, and you can see our investment rates started declining from 2011 onwards. Whereas China's investment rates, on the other hand, actually started increasing. From 40% actually went up to close to 50%, whereas India's fell to, the latest, if 2021, I think it was around 30%. Now you have low investment, you also have major infrastructural problems. I was talking about Coimbatore. In fact, I used to visit Coimbatore very frequently, in the early 2010s. Power shortage was a major constraint in Coimbatore. So there used to be 6 hours of power cut for many of these are power intensive industries, like say, pump manufacturing. Last year we were in Ludhiana. Last year, just 1 year, exactly 1 year back. Ludhiana is again a major industrial center with very large small industries. Power shortages were a major issue. So I think that is one area where small industries face a problem. Credit is already mentioned. But lastly, I think a demand problem is something which I also want to highlight, because this has been a problem which was even talked about in the Indian context from the 1960s. Srini, you may remember some of these debates about India's industrial growth stagnation from the 1960s. Because the argument then was that the demand is coming from a small section of the population, whereas you don't have mass demand. Although you have a very large population, you don't have mass demand. Unfortunately, that seems to be the case even today. 2011-12 is the last, of course, we have that data on consumption expenditure. But the 2011-12 consumption expenditure data tells us that when it comes to consumer durables, let's say television or mobile phone, 50% of the demand comes from the richest 10%. So, whereas the unorganized sector is largely catering to the poor. Now, if the poor do not have the demand, so you have 200 million entrepreneurs here. They're all catering to the demand coming from the poor. So these entrepreneurs can actually, they can become more, they can grow in size, they can grow in business volumes if you have a much, if you have greater incomes with these poor who cater to, whose demand, who buy from the unorganized enterprises.
Let's turn back to something that you just mentioned, which is the high rates of private capital formation in that period about 10 years ago when it was really peak. And I do recall, and you may want to reflect upon that, if in the success of raising the rate of investment, what was the role, say, of public procurement policy, in say electricity, this thing which led to very high levels of investment in power generation, or credit, where actually banks expanded their balance sheets in terms of lending to investment and infrastructural projects. So do these things, whether it's credit policy or public procurement policy or others, also in a sense, can they contribute to investment rates and industrialization?
Yes, I remember that credit was a factor, and I guess many scholars have also noted that. While I mentioned that credit to micro and small industries were falling, credit to bigger industries was rising during the 2000s. So credit was clearly a factor which helped, the big industries, increase the investment at that time. And I understand that was also a time, and even now, the big industries have, I think they continue to have access to credit, not just credit from domestic banking system, but also credit from international sources. So yes, and I think we have enough resources in this country. So in fact, even the banking system do have the resources to lend both to the big firms as well as to the small firms. But I guess the reason why this is not taking off, investment is not taking off. So I don't think it is lack of credit. Lack of credit is a problem for the small entrepreneurs. But lack of credit, I don't think is a problem for the big entrepreneurs. I think it's a clear case. It's a clear classic case, what in a textbook case that we always teach in macroeconomics. Credit is available, or the banks have the resources to lend credit. But there is no demand in the economy, or probably there is not enough demand to enthuse the private sector. There is demand, there's a large country, there's a large middle class, but that is not enough perhaps to enthuse the middle class. Because I think still, incomes are somewhat stagnant. You see the employment numbers. The employment numbers have been somewhat stagnant. When you talk about the employment in the high wage sectors, the modern sectors, the modern employment have been somewhat stagnant in this country for the last 10 years. So that is where the demand comes. No? The demand should come from the middle classes which have more incomes. So I guess that is the problem. Animal spirits are clearly lacking.
Thank you. Let's just turn back to where you began, in fact, that our entire discussion on industrial policy including even the finer aspects of industrial policy which try to influence the flow of resources and output growth in specific sectors, shifting the balance across sectors within manufacturing. Now, all of this, what are some of the key challenges these present to orthodox economic thinking, yeah, or orthodox or neoclassical economic thinking? What, in your view, would be one, two, three key challenges that they pose, which orthodox thinking has to sort of review, study, and in a sense renew itself on? And one you'd mentioned comparative advantage, but which you
So I think
talked
you're
about a bit.
asking about India's in the planning effort and probably what went wrong.
No, in fact, how does that feed back? How
does-
do you think should orthodox economic thinking reflect upon this? Because it challenges some of the key tenets, including what you said about getting the relative prices wrong. So, there's a welfare gain in getting the relative prices wrong, whereas orthodox thinking tells us that you must get the relative prices right. So there's a clear sort of upturning of a certain position, which is what you just spoke about earlier.
Thank you. I think there are two things here. Which first is I want to go back to the planning effort, not to just India but also China. And I still think that the 1950s effort by these two countries, large, populous, underdeveloped countries, has been clearly path-breaking. And I guess that is not studied enough by the economics profession, because you wanted to you leapfrog into a very modern economic structure by these two countries. And the thing, and the most striking aspect is that these countries were successful to a great extent in building modern industries out of nowhere. And of course, you also have the Soviet experience a few years previously. Again, Russia was one of the less developed economies in Europe. With planned industrialization, it could actually leapfrog into the front lines in economy in Europe. So I think the importance of planning in building a modern economic structure, especially in a less developed economy, that has to be studied in detail. What went wrong with the Indian experience in particular is that planning was somewhat imposed in a social structure which continued to be underdeveloped, which continued to have very high inequalities. Our land reforms were not successful. Land reforms were, on the other hand, were very successful in China as well as in the rest of East Asia, including Japan, South Korea. So an egalitarian social structure was the springboard for successful economic growth and industrialization in East Asia as well as in China, whereas we didn't have that advantage, and the inequalities in rural asset inequalities, which continue to even today. That's actually one of the biggest constraints to our growth. So I guess instead of while it is clear that Indian planning was only modestly successful, instead of kind of completely dismissing that as a failure, we have to also understand what went right and what went wrong. And now coming back to the present, I think China's success is again something which has to be studied. Like I already mentioned, China in 2010 was largely known as a labor-intensive as country, factory of the world, and not known as a country for technologically advanced industries. That is, you are talking about 15 years back, 12 years back. But in the last 10 to 15 years, China has actually managed to become a competitor to the US in many technologically advanced industries. And a lot of it has to do with the investment, the jump in investment rate which I mentioned. Post 2007, China had this big jump in investment rates. And a large part of that investment came from state-owned enterprises. And a large part of those investments went into sectors which the Chinese planners, the Chinese industrial, those who designed Chinese industrial policy thought were the new and emerging industries. So they invested in quantum computing, they invested in renewable energy, they invested in all those emerging biotechnology, all those emerging industries. So that is clearly one example. And I guess another point about so state investment is clearly important. Now, but one question, of course, when it comes to state intervention is where do the state has? Does the state have enough resources? In fact, that is one big question coming from the mainstream economists. Now, I think that also we have to see what has happened. Let's say for China, China's that spurt in investment from 2010, a large part of it was financed by debt. So there was again big concern coming from mainstream economists. Look, China is on a huge debt trap. China will implode any time. China's economy will be facing trouble any time. But that did not happen. Why that did not happen? It did not happen because China's debt was largely internal debt. And China is a country, China was taking loans from its own banks, the banking system that it had in the country. Now it's a country with huge resources and huge untapped resources. So you are taking a loan from your own banking system. And I think that's a lesson for India. India is now a country with huge untapped resources, much more than China today, much more than China possibly in 15 years back even. So what we need is, instead of worrying so much about the fiscal deficit, we should use our domestic financial institutions, we should use our banking system to support government investment. Because ultimately when you are taking a loan from your own financial institutions, you are taking a loan from your own people. In fact, I say that many Indian families take loans to teach their children, for their children's higher education. That is because we are in a situation where many of the families have to depend on private finance colleges. But what the state builds, state takes a loan from its own financial institutions, takes a loan from its own people, build the colleges, build the universities, build the research institutions that, as I mentioned, can revive both the supply and the demand for skills, for infrastructure, it can actually change our economic trajectory.
No, you also draw attention, in fact, to what the Chinese state did, which is direct public investment to first movers. Now, there's a lot of literature where first movers absorb social costs, and actually make transparent the risks in certain sectors, and therefore should be publicly funded. And you offer China as an example of what is now increasingly getting justified in economic mainstream as a theme which should justifiably draw public investment in terms of welfare gains. So thank you very much for this discussion.
I just wanted to say that it's not just China, it's also the US. In fact, the US experience is now much more talked about. In fact, so you have two extremes. We think they are extremes, but then both have actually used the same strategy, same logic in building. In fact, they are the technology leaders today. Both have actually taken the same route. So Mariano Mazzucato's work essentially tells us that it is the government which built the technological capabilities in the US. The China story is probably less known, but it's clearly state-owned enterprises which have taken the lead in building China's technological superiority. So yes, I think that is a lesson for all developing countries, India in particular, South Asian countries in particular, and also all African countries, which are all struggling to industrialize and economically move ahead. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jayan.